Today's video is all about how the lungs are involved in gaseous exchange, and that just basically means the exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen between the blood and the lungs, or between the blood and the air in the lungs that you breathe in. Okay, so the first thing is just to remember the names of a couple of key parts. The first part here is called the thorax, and that's just what you would call the chest area. Just below the chest area is the abdomen, and separating the thorax and the abdomen is a special muscle which is just found just below the lungs there. You might be able to see it in white just there, and that's called the diaphragm. I remember it as diaphragm in my head so that I can spell it correctly. That might be important if you get a 6-mark question about it. But there's the diaphragm. It's actually a muscle which separates the thorax and the abdomen, and it's actually involved also in ventilation, which we'll talk about in a sec. So we're going to switch from this quite nice picture to a slightly less technical version of the picture that I've just drawn. And what we've got is we've got a picture of the lungs with just 4 ribs I've drawn there. I haven't drawn the whole set of ribs. We've got the lungs, we've got the ribs which make up the rib cage, which has the job of not only helping in breathing but also protecting the lungs and the heart that's just below. We've got the rib cage, and we've got the diaphragm, which we've already mentioned. Okay, so there's the diaphragm in red, the rib cage with the slightly bluey color there, and the lungs underneath. And during the point where you have exhaled, the diaphragm is in this kind of curved position, and if you look from the side, this is supposed to be a side view of the ribs. So this is the back, this is supposed to be the spine, this is the front, and again the diaphragm you can see just underneath the lungs. Now, in order to ventilate the lungs, in order to get air into the lungs, we have to change the shape or the volume of the lungs, and the way that happens is we have the ribs which move upwards and outwards. So if we look at both views, we've got the ribs here. You can see they've moved, they've kind of flattened out a bit, but what that's done is actually caused an upwards and outwards movement, and that's increased the volume of the lungs. We'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a moment. So the ribs move up and out. We have the diaphragm which has moved downwards, and therefore that causes the lungs to change their shape, increases the volume, and causes air to move in. And you can also see that in the diagram from the side. So the diaphragm there has flattened out, and the ribs have moved upwards and outwards, which is in that diagonal direction there to increase the volume. So basically, to make air move into the lungs, the rib cage moves up and out, and the diaphragm becomes flatter. If you want to make air move out of the lungs, well, these changes are reversed. So going backwards, the diaphragm will actually relax, it becomes curved as it is there, and the ribs move downwards and inwards to exhale the air. Okay, so that's just an overview of how the mechanism works, but you need to be able to explain it in terms of changes in the volume and in changes in the pressure within the lungs. So I've simplified the whole thing. This is the pair of lungs which I've just put into sort of one diagram. We've got the ribs here in blue, and in between the ribs we've got muscles, which is in that kind of pink color. They actually have a special name. They're called intercostal muscles, and these are muscles that are found in between the ribs. And the first thing that happens is these muscles contract, and that's what causes the rib cage to move upwards and outwards. So we have the muscles between the ribs contracting. At the same time, we have the diaphragm which also contracts, and that makes the diaphragm flatter. And because it's flatter, it draws the bottom of the lungs downwards. That results in a higher or an increased volume inside the lungs, and that means there is a lower pressure inside the lungs, or you could say a lower air pressure. And because there's lower air pressure, there is a higher pressure on the outside, and therefore air is drawn into the lungs. That's very badly drawn. Let's do that again. Just make it one error. Nice and simple. Okay, so air is drawn into the lungs as a result of the muscles between the ribs contracting, the diaphragm also contracting and becoming flatter. That means we have a higher volume of space inside the lungs, lower air pressure, therefore air moves in. In order to remove air, the opposite happens. So the muscles between the ribs relax. This causes the ribs to go downwards and inwards. We have the diaphragm, which also relaxes. Remember, the diaphragm is also a muscle, so that relaxes. That actually causes a lower or decrease volume in the lungs. That increases the pressure or the air pressure inside the lungs, and that will cause the air to move out. And this happens alternately 24 hours a day, 7 days a week throughout your lifetime. Okay, so I guess the key and most important part of this video is this last slide, being able to explain the mechanism for how the lungs draw air in and how they get rid of air. This whole process is called ventilation, and that's basically how you would describe it. Okay, so that's me done for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again